This video is made possible by Brilliant. You'll learn more about Brilliant later in today's video, but if you would like to learn more about them right now, go to brilliant.org/biographics. You'll also find a link in the description below. He was America's first and most celebrated Western anti-hero. It was claimed that he killed 21 men, one for every year of his young life, and the press portrayed him as a ruthless, psychotic, wild-eyed killer. The reality was that Billy the Kid was none of these things, and in this week's Biographics, we go in search of the real Billy. There is uncertainty as to the birthplace of the child who would become Billy the Kid. Most historians believe it was the slums of New York City and the year was 1859. His birth name was Henry McCarty, and he was the son of Irish immigrants who had come to America to escape the devastating effects of the Irish potato famine. His mother's name was Catherine, but we know nothing about his father except that he died when Henry was an infant. When Henry was around 6, he and his mother joined the post-Civil War exodus to the West in search of the better life that had so far eluded them in the New World. They joined a wagon train and undertook the arduous journey over the Oregon Trail. They got as far as Indianapolis, Indiana. There, Carolyn met and married a man by the name of William Harrison Antrim. Antrim had dreams of striking it rich in the gold mines to the southwest, and soon the makeshift family had relocated to Silver City, New Mexico. New Mexico in the early 1870s was like a foreign country to immigrants from the east. It was mainly peopled by Mexicans and Native Americans. The entire culture and religion was very different to what most Americans were used to. French, Spanish, and Navajo were more likely to be spoken than English, and most houses were mesas carved into the sides of rock formations. In this hodgepodge of cultures, violence was commonplace. While many newcomers from the East would have recoiled at such an environment, young Henry McCarty, he embraced it. He immersed himself in the Mexican culture, spending most of his time in the Hispanic part of town. By the time he was a teenager, he could speak fluent Spanish and could even pass for a native Mexican with his sombrero and poncho. Whenever there was a public Mexican social event, Henry would be there, often with his mother. The two would dance the fandango together and talk easily with the Mexican elders. Unlike most of the Europeans in town, Henry showed respect to the locals, exhibiting a formal politeness to the older generation, which won him a lot of praise. He was remembered by the Hispanic community as a charming boy who was always happy. The humor was cruelly snatched from Henry's life when, at the age of 15, he suffered the loss of his mother. Catherine had been suffering from tuberculosis for some time, and it was hoped that the dry air of New Mexico would improve her condition. But it wasn't to be. Catherine died in 1874, leaving Henry in the possession of his stepfather, William Antrim. Antrim, however, had no intention of being tied down with a teenage boy to look after. He promptly abandoned Henry, leaving town in search of more fertile gold diggings. So, at the age of 15, Henry was left on his own to fend for himself in a dangerous frontier town. Henry now had to live off his wits. He spent his time hanging around the saloons and prostitutes on the seedier side of town, sleeping in back alleys and boarding houses, and running errands to pay his way. He soon became involved in minor criminal activity, meeting up with a hoodlum by the name of Sombrero Jack. Henry was recruited as a lookout while Jack robbed local businesses. One of them was the local Chinese laundry. Things fell apart when a loaded revolver that Jack had stolen from the laundry was found in Henry's possession. The boy was arrested and thrown into the local jail. It was while sitting in that tiny jail cell that Henry made a fateful decision. He could have sat and waited for the circuit judge to come to town and try his case, but that may have taken months. Instead, he decided to escape. In doing so, he honed a skill that would serve him to good effect many times over the next 5 years. That was getting people to underestimate his abilities. Henry talked his guard into allowing him to come out of his cell for a short period in order to stretch his legs. He was still confined to the jailhouse, and the door to the outside world was securely locked. But there was also a chimney. When his guard was out of the room, Henry managed to squeeze his slight frame up the soot-covered escape hole and onto the roof, and then into the town plaza. By the time it was discovered that he had escaped, he was free of Silver City and en route to Arizona. Carrying no food supplies and without a horse, Henry displayed an incredible physical and mental strength in crossing the desert plains of the Southwest. He quickly learned that he had to live off the land, foraging where he could and stealing where he must. The 16-year-old wanted fugitive made it across 500 miles of deserts before stumbling into a remote army outpost in eastern Arizona called Camp Grant. Here, he managed to find employment as a cook on a local ranch. After hours, he drifted to the local town where he took to gambling and hustling in the saloons. The men he was now associated with included some hardened criminals, and they quickly showed him the ropes. Before long, he was participating in stealing horses. Outside of his ranch duties and his nefarious nighttime activities, young Henry found the time to perfect his skills with a firearm. He had managed to buy a revolver and quickly discovered an innate ability to wield it. With this skill came instant respect from those around him. Within a year of escaping the jail cell in Silver City, Henry had developed into a character of note among thugs in the Arizona Territory. He wore a brightly colored scarf around his neck and walked with the self-assuredness of a man many years older than his only 17 years. And it was at this time that people began to call him the Kid. It was August the 17th, 1877, when the Kid went from small-time crook to hardened killer. The local blacksmith was a bully by the name of Frank Cahill. On that night, while drinking in a saloon, Cahill had his sights set on Henry, and he was throwing insults at the Kid. When the Kid called him a son of a bitch, Cahill jumped him and proceeded to pound him on the saloon floor. Pinned underneath the bigger man, the Kid managed to free his six-shooter. He shot Cahill in the stomach and then quickly slid out from under him. Leaving the blacksmith to die, he hightailed it out of town on a stolen horse and headed back to New Mexico. Now a wanted fugitive for the crime of murder, the Kid changed his name to William H. Bonney. He wandered across the vast open spaces, relying on the hospitality of Hispanic ranchers to provide him with a meal or a place to lay his head. Meanwhile, New Mexico was being targeted by big-shot land speculators from back east. They saw the mostly barren territory as a golden opportunity for speculation, and they began buying up land parcels from Hispanic settlers, usually at prices that were manifestly unfair to the seller. Those who didn't want to sell their lands likely were going to find themselves facing violent persecution. Soon, the eastern entrepreneurs had wrested control of every industry in the state, from mining to the cattle industry and even the railroads. The largest county in New Mexico was Lincoln, which covered nearly a fifth of the entire territory. It was there, in 1878, that a war broke out that would have a profound effect on the remaining years of Billy the Kid's life. In the late 1860s, a couple of Irish immigrants by the names of Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan had bought up the majority of Lincoln County and turned it into a huge cattle ranch. They had secured extremely large military contracts to supply beef to Fort Stanton. The Murphy-Dolan monopoly in Lincoln County was called the House, and it was fiercely protected by a band of thugs known as the Seven Rivers Gang. They operated from a huge wooden building in the middle of the Lincoln Township and controlled every business in town. In 1877, the House monopoly over Lincoln County was challenged, first in court and then on the range by a Scottish-born local attorney by the name of Alexander McSween. Teaming up with the lawyer was a 23-year-old, recently arrived British aristocrat by the name of John Tunstall. With a seemingly unending supply of funds, Tunstall was intent on creating his own cattle empire in the county. In this quest, he enjoyed the support of the most successful and famous cattle baron in the entire country, John Chisholm. Tunstall began to recruit employees not only to work the cattle, but also provide the protection that he knew would be needed when he came up against the House. William Bonney rode into Lincoln County in mid-1877 and immediately proceeded to do what he did best, and that was steal horses. In short order, he was caught and thrown in jail. It just so happened that the man he had been rustling horses from, well, that was John Tunstall. When the Englishman confronted the teenage outlaw, he declined to press charges. Instead, he offered the kid a job as a member of the regulators, the team of cowboys that were his protection squad. Billy, he grabbed this offer with both hands. In John Tunstall, he had found a man who would give him a fair break. He later said this of his employer: "Tunstall was the only man who treated me like I was decent and white." The kid joined a group of men, all older than him, as he learned the work of a cowboy. It was long, arduous, often back-breaking work, and they slept out with the cattle on the range. For the leaders of the House, Murphy and Dolan, the idea of an upper-crust Englishman moving in on their territory was unthinkable. Like the kids' parents, they had escaped the famine back in Ireland and deeply resented the English over their unwillingness to provide relief. Now, having found a new life in the New World, were they again to be plagued by the power and the money of the English? Well, that's something they would never allow to happen. Murphy and Dolan's power extended to control of the legal system that Lincoln County operated under. They enlisted the aid of William Brady, the corrupt sheriff, to enforce a fake court order that confiscated all of the horses and cattle on the Tunstall ranch. When Tunstall received the demand, he thought it was some kind of mistake and proceeded to ride into town in order to sort things out. On the way there, he was met by the sheriff and a posse of men on their way to execute the court order. Still thinking he could reason with the lawman, Tunstall rode towards the sheriff. But before he got close, members of the posse, they shot him dead. To add insult to injury, they then shot his horse. Tunstall's body was soon found by the men who worked for him and taken back to his ranch for burial. Billy was incensed at the cold-blooded assassination of his boss, and he, along with a group of hardcore other employees, made a pact of vengeance against the House. They made a hit list, at the top of which was the Sheriff of Lincoln County, William Brady. Brady's end came on April Fool's Day 1878, as he was taking his morning stroll through Lincoln. Billy and his fellow regulators were lying in ambush and poured more than a dozen bullets into his body. During the gunfight that ensued with Brady's deputies, Billy was shot in the thigh. 3 days later, a shootout occurred at Blazer's Mill. This time, 2 of the regulators were killed. As a result of the 2 incidents, several murder warrants were issued, including one for Billy. The conflict came to a head when Alexander McSween rode from the Tunstall Ranch with between 50 and 60 regulators on July 14, 1868. Some of the men strategically positioned themselves between buildings and on rooftops, while others, including Billy, set themselves up in a house that belonged to McSween. For the next 2 days, they waited. On July the 16th, the new sheriff, George Pepin, sent some men to kill the regulators who were stationed on the roof of the saloon. After one of their number was killed, these men were forced to retreat. Pepin now sent a message to Fort Sumner requesting military assistance. The request was initially turned down, but the military brass changed their mind the next day. With that, Colonel Nathan Dudley rode into town at the head of a troop of soldiers. A standoff ensued for a couple more days. Then, on Friday, July the 19th, all hell broke loose. The regulators were now all holed up in the McSween house. A massive barrage of firepower was unleashed on this house, with return fire coming just as fiercely. Then, the house was set on fire. In an attempt to escape, Alexander McSween was shot dead. Billy managed to kill the man who had felled McSween before making good on his own escape along with the other regulators. Now, just before we get into the rest of Billy's life, I do want to take a moment to thank the people who make this video possible, and that would be Brilliant. I know a mid-roll ad is not great for the story here, but these videos are long, so I do hope you appreciate our need to have sponsors to make them possible. Brilliant are a learning platform which teaches through something called active learning. Unlike biographies, which are just a nice way to learn about people's lives, learning about science is a bit trickier. I don't know if you've ever had to sit down with a science textbook. I have, and I read them, and there's a whole lot of stuff that makes me think, what, hold on a second, and then you end up reading the page 6 times over and you're still not taking it in. Well, Brilliant solves that problem with active learning. Brilliant give you something super short to read, it's really easy, and then you immediately apply it to a problem. You rinse and repeat that, and suddenly you're understanding all sorts of stuff that you really didn't think you'd be able to. I've been using Brilliant, and you should just go try it just to see how easy it is to suddenly be understanding all these complex subjects. It's really Brilliant just make them super easy to grasp. You can support Biographics by going to brilliant.org/biographics. And now, let's get back to the kid. By now, Billy had developed into a seasoned killer. He was now wanted for multiple counts of murder in different jurisdictions. Still, he was able to find refuge with the Hispanic sheepherders who viewed him as a fighter for their liberty against the Anglo robber barons. The firestorm that had erupted in the heart of Lincoln County forced authorities to act. Indictments were issued for the arrest of Billy and 2 other regulators for the murder of Sheriff Brady. A new governor of New Mexico Territory was also appointed. The man given the job was Lew Wallace, a former Union Army general and future author of the book Ben-Hur. Wallace set out for Lincoln County with direct instructions from President Rutherford B. Hayes to restore order. But Wallace encountered a population who were too terrified to get involved and so was unable to secure any witness testimonies as to what had been occurring. Then he received a letter from a man calling himself William H. Bonney. The kid offered to testify against the members of the House in return for full amnesty, and Wallace agreed. Billy testified before a grand jury, with his testimony leading to indictments against a number of House members, including leader James Dolan. Billy had lived up to his side of the deal, but unfortunately the governor did not live up to his, skipping town before the amnesty could be formalized. With the governor gone, most of the indictments against the House members, they were dropped, but those against the regulators, they remained. Billy fled town before he could be arrested. While the other regulars fled New Mexico Territory, Billy decided to stay put and eke out a living as a cattle and horse rustler. Over the next few months, he harassed the ranchers of the House Empire, in the process becoming the most wanted man in New Mexico. The newspapers of New Mexico, most of which were simply mouthpieces for the House, demonized the kid, blaming him for every misdeed in the territory. In 1880, the editor of the Las Vegas Gazette first named the outlaw Billy the Kid, the name for which he would forever be known. By the summer of 1880, though he still roamed the territory, Billy had made a base for himself at Fort Sumner, some 100 miles from Lincoln. By now, Lincoln had a new sheriff, and his name was Pat Garrett, and he was single-minded with his obsession to capture Billy the Kid. Garrett was a tenacious, determined man. He and his posse tracked Billy and his gang over the winter of 1880. Two of the outlaws were killed in a shootout, with the others being cornered in a cabin at a place called Stinking Springs. After a tense standoff, Billy finally came out with his hands in the air. The kid was transported by train to Santa Fe and put on trial for the murder of Sheriff Brady. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The next and supposedly last stop was Lincoln, where he was held in a second-story room of the Lincoln County Courthouse. It was there that he was to wait for his date with the noose. But, well, Billy, he had other plans. On April 28, 1881, in the early afternoon, Billy told his guard that he needed to use the privy. The guard escorted him, in shackles, to the outhouse. On the way back, as he went up the stairs to his room, Billy managed to slip out of his hand shackles. He turned and wrestled with the guard, managing to grab his gun. The man turned to flee, but Billy shot him dead. The kid then made for one of the rooms in which he knew there was a shotgun. Quickly loading it, he ran to a window and looked down on the street to see another guard, Bob Olinger, who had been eating his lunch across the way, come running to investigate. Billy called out, "Hello, Bob," before blasting him with both barrels. With both guards dead, Billy then raced downstairs. He commandeered a horse and was away. Billy's daring escape made him the most famous outlaw in the country, but it also made him a 3-time cop killer. This changed Pat Garrett's mind. Now he wanted to hunt him down and kill him. Despite this, Billy chose to remain in New Mexico. The reason being is that he had fallen in love with a 16-year-old girl by the name of Paulita Maxwell. Back in Lincoln, Garrett was receiving information as to the whereabouts of the kid. They were being supplied by the older brother of Paulita, Pete Maxwell, who was not happy about this romance. He told Garrett that Billy was in Fort Sumner. Garrett finally moved on the intelligence. He stole into Fort Sumner on the evening of July 14, 1881, with 2 deputies alongside him. They went straight to the home of the Maxwells. Posting the 2 deputies on the front porch, he entered the house from the back and made for the bedroom of Pete Maxwell. At this very moment, Billy was approaching the porch. In the dark, he could only just make out the shape of the 2 men there, and he called out, "Who is it?" But there was no reply. At this, Billy cautiously backed through the open doorway. Inside, Garrett and Maxwell were sitting on the bed. On seeing the figure, Maxwell leaned over and whispered, "It's him." Garrett leveled his 6-shooter and fired. Billy the Kid fell dead, never knowing who had fired the fatal bullet. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this 2 times a week. Also, do check out Brilliant. You'll find a link to them in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.